Hi, Morgan. Welcome to the Sakara Life podcast. Thanks so much for being here today.
Thank you. It's great to be here with you guys.
We like to start off every podcast with the question around your mission. So, what are you here to do? What are you here to give to the world?
I would say my mission is to help women become their healthiest selves. And I do that by helping them get better sleep.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I'm so grateful that sleep is having a moment right now
Yes.
as a mother of two kids. But I feel like growing up, rest, relaxation, sleep, sleep rituals, sleep hygiene, it wasn't really talked about. So how did you get into this space? What brought you into the space of, helping women feel better, especially through sleep and sleep hygiene?
Yeah. So I had a very bad bout of insomnia in my mid-30s, and it lasted for about 8 years. And I had what we call sleep onset insomnia, which is basically a fancy way of saying I had a hard time falling asleep in the beginning of the night. I would lie there for like 1 to 2 hours most nights, tossing and turning. After a few months of that, I decided to go to my family doctor, and he gave me an Ambien, which I'm sure everyone's heard of. At that point in my life, I was a pharmaceutical sales rep. So my currency was medication. And so when I was offered the Ambien, I did not hesitate at all. And, it did work as advertised. It did help me get to sleep more quickly, but I really paid the price the next day with grogginess and brain fog. And I just kept that pattern for 8 years of just kind of like lagging in the morning, feeling almost hungover without the alcohol. It's a very strange sensation. And so 8 years into that, I met a guy. I started dating, newly in the relationship, and spoiler alert, we're now married. So there's a happy ending to this. He said, "Morgan, when you take those pills, you act like a zombie, and it really freaks me out." And I thought, oh gosh, I just got called out, but in the best way. So I decided to take myself off the sleeping pills. And for anyone listening who's on a sleeping pill or psychiatric med or whatever med, really, I just urge you to consult with your prescribing provider before you decide to take yourself off your meds, because there's a proper way to do it. And I did not know any better. But because I've got a lot of grit and determination, I was able to get off the pills pretty well. Slept fine for years after that. And then there was a plot twist, which we collectively experienced. Think back to March 2020, the first couple months of the pandemic, when nobody knew what was going on. There was just a lot of anxiety free floating around. And my sleep started to suffer at that point. And I got really concerned because I did not want to go back to full-blown insomnia. So I got myself an Oura Ring, started to research sleep, and I was able to get my sleep corrected in fairly short order. And during this process, I just started organically posting on Facebook things that I was doing to help my sleep. And I came to find out at this time that a lot of other women in my circle were struggling with their sleep as well. And 2 years prior to this, just a little side note, I did have a breast cancer experience. And that was like what really propelled me into the mission of helping women get healthy. And I knew at that point I wanted to do that as far as a career, but I didn't know how that would play out. And once I became so fascinated with this topic of sleep, all the stars aligned. And I thought, I'm going to be a holistic sleep coach for women. This was late in 2020. And I was so excited. But of course, you can't just hang a shingle and say, I'm this. You have to go get trained and qualified. So I spent a year getting health coach certified, sleep coach certified, and then launched the practice in 2021. And so that's kind of my long, winding story about how I got here and how I'm so passionate about helping other women get the sleep that they deserve.
Can you talk to us about what happens in sleep and why it's so important? Because, I think we are the generation that is like learning the hard way that sleep is important. And I think what, we were taught was go, go, go. And I think now we're all learning that we have to rest and recuperate and rejuvenate. But it's especially hard in this world. And so I think in order to prioritize it, people have to understand just how critical it is and that you cannot like make up for it in other ways.
Yeah, it's so interesting because if you think about the topics of nutrition and movement, there is so much information about that. And we've kind of been conditioned as women to, eat healthy and to work out. But the sleep piece, you're right, really got left out of the conversation. I look at it as sort of like the sleep, nutrition, and movement are sort of the foundations of health, but sleep has sort of been the redheaded stepchild, the one that got left out of the conversation. So in a way, I look at myself as kind of a PR agent for sleep, just spreading the word about what it does. But really, if you think about anything that's important to you, sleep affects it in some way. So we can I'll give you a kind of a quick rundown of what's happening while we sleep. And I think one of the things that's getting a lot of attention lately is how much it can help our brain health. So we have a lymphatic system, which is sort of like the sewage system of our body, but we have a glymphatic system, which is the same thing for our brain. So it's like the waste management system up in our noggin. And while we're in deep sleep, our lymphatic system is hard at work and it's wringing out those toxins that accumulate during the day. So we're getting essentially a good brainwashing overnight, which is so important for cognitive health and our brain health as we age. And then we have a whole host of things happening with hormone balancing while we're sleeping. It's helping regulate our cortisol, our melatonin, our sex hormones. And then on the emotional piece, I think a lot of people forget about this, but sleep is so critical for our emotional regulation and mood management. So, when I'm going throughout my day and if I get cut off in traffic or somebody, offers me an unkind gesture while I'm driving, I almost always think that poor person didn't get enough sleep. Right? Because our REM sleep is that critical phase of sleep that happens that really is primarily responsible for regulating our emotions. So if we're not getting enough, we're going to get snappy. We've all been there. We've all had a bad night of sleep. We've probably snapped at our partners and kids and coworkers. So yeah, overall, sleep is just critically important to everything we do. And unfortunately, sometimes in our culture, it's, this hustle culture, which you referred to, it's sort of like, I'll sleep when I'm dead. And the ship is starting to turn. And I am seeing a lot more talk in the world, in the media, on social media, especially about the value of sleep, but still there's a lot of work that needs to be done.
And can you talk to us about the different cycles of sleep? You hear about REM sleep and deep sleep and light sleep, but what are those and what should we be aiming for in terms of how much of each?
That's a great question. So light sleep is something that we kind of start our night off with, and we actually get about 50 to 60% of our total sleep as light sleep. So it's a valuable phase of sleep, and it's the most predominant. REM, which I just referred to, is really primarily you can think of REM as sleep that's more beneficial for the mind, right? So learning and memory, emotional regulation. That part of sleep, the REM cycle, usually happens toward the latter part of the night. So, especially in the first, the first hours before you're waking, when you're dreaming, that's really kind of when you're in the REM phase. And that's generally, for most healthy adults, about 25% of the time you're sleeping. And then we have deep sleep, which everyone is so obsessed about. It's an amazing stage of sleep. And that is something that happens really in the first half of your night. So typically 20% is a great number to aim for. And that's really the stage of sleep that's mostly involved with the bodily repair, the glymphatic system, which I just mentioned with the clearing out the brain, the regulation of hormones, helping us fight infection. Now, I just do want to clarify, though, that something interesting happens as we get older with our deep sleep. And I think this is important to sort out, because I have a lot of clients who are tracking their sleep with an Oura Ring or another tracker. And they notice that their deep sleep starts to become less and less over time. And I've personally noticed this myself. I've been tracking with an Aura for 5 years. And by the time you reach your late 40s, you're getting about half the deep sleep you got in your 20s. So I had a client, for example, in her mid 50s who was doing a little comparison challenge, if you will, with her 23-year-old daughter. And they were comparing deep sleep. And I said, that's unfair. That's just an unfair advantage she has over you because she's so much younger. So I really do want to call that out, that as we get older, we just are going to expect our deep sleep to start to peter out a little bit over time. So just something to think about if you're in your late 40s and beyond and you're tracking and you're getting worried. That's nature doing its thing.
And is there a way to increase that deep sleep? I think about this as, if that's our time where our bodies are doing a lot of the repair, then is that lack of deep sleep, that decline in deep sleep related to aging and having our bodies age as well?
That's a really important question that we're all, I think, in the sleep space thinking about. Some of the things that we can do, though, to kind of ensure that we get the most deep sleep that we can, a few things that I'll call out is, number one, exercising. We have a meta-analysis of 13 different studies backing up the fact that regular exercise helps your deep sleep. And that's especially true with people who are middle-aged and older. So if you're listening and you want more deep sleep, do yourself a favor and get like 30 minutes of moderate exercise, ideally 5 days a week to boost your deep sleep. Other, quote, hacks, I don't like the word hack, but it kind of fits in this situation. Sleeping cool. So if your environment is cool, like your mattress is cool, your sheets are cool, your pajamas are cool, and the room is cool, the ambient temperature is cool, you're going to probably notice deeper sleep in that situation. And then with eating, I would say definitely I've noticed for sure better deep sleep scores when I eat on the earlier end of the night. If I leave like ideally 3 to 4 hours between my dinner and bedtime, I'm noticing deeper sleep. So those are some ways that you can kind of tend to your deep sleep. But yeah, those are basic things to do.
And is that where you start? So people who are, either experiencing insomnia or things that feel like insomnia, how would you approach kind of helping people fix that? And then separately, like, is there a difference between people who can't fall asleep versus people who can't stay asleep? And do you suggest different things?
Yeah, good questions. So typically where I start with my clients is helping them get their circadian rhythm dialed in, because good sleep is the output of a strong circadian rhythm. And so some of the things that I suggest for a strong circadian rhythm are things that we can do that are under our control. So a few things would be waking up at the same time every morning. That's like such a critical piece of where I start with clients, is getting their sleep-wake cycle kind of realigned, regulated, if you will. And we start with that consistent wake time every morning. And another thing that I really lean in on is morning sunlight exposure. There's a lot we could talk about with that, but that really anchors your circadian rhythm. And that's something that you can control pretty much for the most part, is getting that natural morning light exposure. And then meal timing is another way that we can influence the strengthening of our circadian rhythm for sure. Now, to answer your question about falling asleep versus staying asleep, I think that's what you were getting at. So a lot of the things are the same. What I was taught in a course by some sleep scientists was pretty interesting. And this is a generality, but I like to kind of start there and then kind of peel the onion layer. So generally speaking, if you are having trouble falling asleep, that's often indicative of anxiety, stress, ruminating thoughts. If people are waking up during the night, that can often point to something physical that's waking them up. So that's just a generality. But again, so many of the same factors that keep us from falling asleep and wake us up are the same. They overlap. And when I'm working with people, I like to, recommend several different types of interventions to kind of cover all our bases, because quite often people have trouble with both. But honestly, in my population of clients, and I just think that when you start asking around, people are having more trouble staying asleep than the wake and then going to sleep. So it's those 3 a.m. wake ups that are really, really getting people.
Yeah, those are hard.
and it's getting people really worried.
And let's talk about interventions for a minute. If you are not recommending Ambien, which I assume that you're not after your experience.
Exactly.
What
Which,
are
by the
certain
way,
types?
a quick side note, Whitney and I once were on a plane trip to Europe together, and then it was like an overnight one. And we saw this woman that was like so clearly on Ambien, and she was sitting next to us, and they had given her meal, but she was asleep. But then she kind of had her eyes open and was like trying to drink the wine while she was clearly sleeping. It was like she was on some sleep medication, and like participating in life. And like I also have some wild stories of people. Like I've had a random love letter sent to me in the middle of the night from someone who then the next morning was like, "Oh, sorry, I took Ambien last night. I have no recollection of sending this email." So it's also like you don't know what happens in sleep. And so when you modulate it with like pharmaceutical drugs, it can feel like things are out of control. Like these are funny examples, but I'm sure there's scary examples too.
Yeah, one of my mom's friends, she, is in her 60s and on Ambien. She posted a picture of herself in a bikini to her Facebook, and then in the morning started getting all of these comments, and she's like, "What is this about?" And I was so embarrassed.
Yeah,
That's awesome.
I've heard so many stories like this. I actually didn't have any really funny stories, but I would often have these eating episodes where I would wake up and there'd be like candy wrappers and cookie boxes. And that's not good for your sleep at all. But on a more serious note, they actually did put a black box warning on Ambien and those types of drugs in 2019 because people were doing things that were actually really harmful, driving under the influence. I mean, I feel really grateful that I didn't get in the car and drive, although in the morning, I was so groggy from the residuals that I think that if you probably drug tested me, I probably would have tested like that I shouldn't be able to drive, almost like the intoxication level.
And isn't this also, didn't they find eventually, I mean, and this is so, pertinent to our listeners and to, I'm sure your clients, but there's not a lot of, as pharmaceutical drugs are brought to market, they can very easily leave out testing on women. And so wasn't it Ambien that they found that the dosage was a universal dosage regardless of gender, but then it turned out women metabolized it much more slowly. And so the effects were much more intense on women than they were on men.
You are exactly right. Yeah. In 2013, the FDA asked the makers of Ambien to adjust their dosages because in effect, women were getting overdosed. So essentially the whole time I was on Ambien, I was being overdosed, which explains so much why I was so groggy and foggy headed during the morning. It wasn't out of my system and I didn't know. So yeah, the cautionary tale about that.
Right. But I mean, lack of sleep, it affects everything.
Oh, yeah.
I have a child with type 1 diabetes, which means we're often up multiple nights out of the week, multiple times per night, managing his blood sugars. And I'd say for the first couple of years, it was really intense. And that would lead to brain fog and things like that. And so I understand, why people can be so desperate for a sleep solution to help them and, to turn to something like an Ambien because it's the most well-known. But
of course.
You're saying there are other options. We recently just put out a supplement that I'm obsessed with. It's called Night Service to get to some of those underlying root causes. And we can talk about that in a minute. But I'd love to hear, what some of your solutions might be.
If I was going to create a supplement for sleep, I would probably have included everything that you included in it, because you thought out very well the ingredients.
Oh, thank you.
Thanks.
Appreciate
Yeah.
that.
So really the main thing that I lean on with my clients who are coming off of a medication, like a sleep medication or a benzo, or they're kind of teetering on the verge of starting one, is something called CBTI. It's called Cognitive Behavioral Therapy for Insomnia. And it's really the gold standard intervention before sleeping pills, according to the American Academy of Physicians. And it's been around since the mid 80s. And unfortunately, not that many people are aware of it. I think word is spreading.
What is it? Like what kind of,
Yeah.
what does that look like?
It's essentially a treatment course that involves changing your behaviors, attitudes, and beliefs around sleep. And it's generally like 6 to 8 sessions, but it can really depend on how long you've had insomnia as to how long it takes you to kind of recover from it, the insomnia. But there are different behavioral techniques that I use that people use for CBTI. The two main behavioral techniques I'll share with you briefly. One is called sleep restriction, and it's a terrible, terrible name. Some people are calling it sleep efficiency training or sleep quality training, which sounds a lot more palatable. You're not really restricting your sleep per se. You're really restricting your time in bed. So what we find quite often with folks who have insomnia is that they'll spend a really long time in their bed, sort of praying and wishing that sleep will come. So it's not atypical to see somebody with insomnia spend like 10 hours in bed only to generate 7 hours of sleep. So what we want to do with that kind of person is give them a time in bed window of 7 hours, because we know that's the amount of sleep they produce. And consequently, what happens when you follow that protocol is that their sleep gets consolidated and their sleep quality goes up. And so that's one really powerful technique. The other one you may have heard before, it's called stimulus control. And again, it's like not a very nice word. It sounds so clinical and cold, but some people call it sleep reconditioning. And essentially the basis behind that is a lot of people with insomnia pair their bed with anxiety. And so what we want to do in that is to unpair any kind of anxiety they feel from their bed or their bedroom environment. And so what that kind of looks like is, if you are in bed and you can't sleep, is to get out of bed and do something relaxing in dim light until you become sleepy again. Typically what you'll see, sort of what I call the old school way of doing this, is if you can't sleep for 20 minutes, or if you're awake for 20 minutes, you get out of bed. I don't really practice in this way. I feel like it's a little too rigid, because number one, you really shouldn't be looking at the clock, right? So I really want people to have a clock out of their bedroom, because that just boosts up your anxiety about sleep exponentially. And I know this is firsthand experience from having insomnia. But what I really try to coach my clients on is listening to their internal cues about their anxiety, how stressed they are in bed, and use that as a cue to get out of bed versus a 20-minute random rule about getting out of bed. And then just the C part of the CBTI is more of the cognitive piece. So a lot of times people with insomnia will have what we call cognitive distortions. For example, a lot of times people will think, if I don't get enough sleep, I'll completely ruin my day tomorrow. I'm going to get fired. I mean, they've got these like worst case scenarios. And what we try to do is really give them more of a balanced perspective and kind of restructure those cognitions so that they're not as catastrophic. And not that we're trying to be Pollyanna and be like, oh, everything's just hunky-dory, but we're really trying to move them into a more of a neutral attitude about their sleep so that they're not quite as panicked over every single thing that's getting disrupted. So that's really the way that, it's a very powerful tool. And again, like I said, it's just as effective, more effective than medications, but it doesn't have any long-term side effects, which a lot of people appreciate.
I love that you're talking about the brain and essentially the nervous system, right? Because you're talking about, lowering anxiety, really, activating the parasympathetic nervous system so that you can rest and relax. I think so many people go from fight or flight all day. I got to answer emails. I got to juggle. I got to make dinner. I got to put the kids to bed. I got to do this to-do list before I can go to sleep. Okay, I'm in bed. Time for sleep. And it's like one more thing on their to-do list instead of this kind of ritualized thing that actually works to calm the nervous system. And that was why when we set out to, create Night Service, our new sleep supplement, it was like, how can we kind of get to the root issue here? Like, I have taken melatonin before and I really don't like it because I've said this before, but it was like, I had this experience of my eyes closing, but I was not ready to go to sleep. Like I felt really out of control, felt really uncomfortable. It felt like, it felt kind of like an Ambien. I've never taken Ambien, but I imagine like, I've taken a NyQuil before or something like that. And it's similar where it's like, this isn't up to me. And I also imagine like that it was just kind of helping symptoms and not root cause. Like if, your melatonin's out of whack, then your circadian rhythm is most likely out of whack. And so when we went to create the supplement, it was like, how do we kind of really nourish the nervous system here? And so we put, our pharma-GABA in and help with that nervous system reaction and, the adaptogens to help promote a healthy nervous system. And what we found and what so many clients have said is like, it helps you fall into relaxation mode. We're not like forcing you into sleep, but what's missing for so many people is that in-between state because it's almost meditative, right? It's like, you can't just go from fight or flight to sleep. You have to get into that really sweet spot of, quieting the mind, quieting the body, and then sleep comes. Like you can't, when you force it, it's really uncomfortable.
Yeah. Matthew Walker, the famous sleep scientist, has a great expression about like, you can't just land the plane.
Yes.
You have to gradually descend right into that state because you're right. So many women who I see are just like, go, go, go. And then they just reach this point where they're like, time to go to bed. And they like, don't have any of that kind of like deceleration of their brain or their body. And so hence they have a hard time getting to sleep. So I think what you're presenting is really smart in terms of, getting those ingredients together, like, and planning that so thoughtfully.
Do you ever I find with my kids, that it's really helpful. We have like this whole, get ready for bed session where it's like you get your sillies out. And actually last night I got them to bed too late. And so we couldn't do it. And my daughter was so upset with me. But it's like, we do something crazy and like big body movements that I find helps them. It's like part of our ritual to help them know it's time for bed. So they look forward to it. It's really fun, but it sort of like is the antithesis to what we're saying, where it's like you like move, go, 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 and then you relax. So does that also work for adults, or is that kind of just like a kid switching, their nervous system?
That is a really good question. And I have to say, I'm not sure because I don't have kids.
Yeah.
And I haven't really studied sleep I don't work with kids, but it's an interesting thought. For adults, I wouldn't, if I was, working with somebody, I would probably not want to get their system, their physical body activated. Now I would actually encourage things like gentle yoga or stretching, like movement,
right.
Like movement of the body could be good because you're getting flow. But, as far as things that like, get you, if they got their heart rate too high, I would want to say, let's not do that.
Right.
But kids are I think they're just wired differently than we are. And I think it's
need to get
obviously
that energy
working
out
in your family. So don't go changing it.
Not going to stop. So I have another question about like the tracker. Like I personally have an aversion to trackers. Like I don't want to know. It brings me stress. It kind of reminds me because I come from a background with disordered eating patterns and like weighing myself. And so it kind of reminds me of that, where it's like a daily reminder that I could be doing something better, something differently. And instead, I really want to like focus on understanding my body cues on my own. And so how can you kind of get to know that about your sleep? Like as someone who doesn't wear an Oura ring or a tracker, how do I know how much deep sleep I'm getting? Is it like how rested I feel in the morning? Is it obvious or are there other kind of more subtle cues?
Well, I love what you're saying because I really don't recommend sleep trackers for everybody. I think it's a really individual choice. You have to know yourself. And if you have those, like people who tend to kind of have that habit of like weighing themselves every day and getting hung up on the numbers, they're often the same types of people who will get hung up on their daily sleep tracker news, right? So you have to really know yourself. And Danielle, you do, obviously, and you're making a really good choice for yourself. So I would never try to sway someone like you into using a tracker. But essentially, like if you're not using a tracker, well, this goes for everybody. No matter what your tracker says, you really need to prioritize how you feel about your sleep and how you feel overall versus what the tracker says, because trackers are not always accurate. And they've even done studies where they've taken somebody who slept very well and they were told, oh, your sleep score wasn't good. And then that person actually exhibited behaviors to reinforce that quote bad sleep they had. So there's a lot of interesting studies in that realm. But how do you know if you've slept well? Do you wake up feeling relatively refreshed? Now, I will kind of give a caveat to this. We have something called sleep inertia. And that is usually this period where we're just kind of just getting up. We're like a little bit groggy. And that usually lasts for like 30, 60 minutes, maybe a little bit longer in some people. So, I've actually worked with clients before who didn't know that was a thing. And they thought something was wrong with them because they weren't like up and at 'em. And so I think one of my clients was even like, well, in movies, they act like that. And I'm like, well, it's a movie. In reality, I mean, I'm a sleep coach. I do all the things for my sleep. I even have sleep inertia. So we have to like kind of give ourselves grace for that period in the morning where we're just kind of like coming to our, kind of getting up and getting our bodies ready for the day. But in general, if you are able to do the things that you need to do during the day, you have enough energy to get through the day, then you're probably doing pretty well with your sleep. And another caveat though, that I'll call out is we have something called a circadian dip, and that's often happening in the early afternoon. And that's why a lot of countries will have these midday siestas where they just don't go to work. They just stop working and they rest. And sometimes people, especially people with insomnia who I work with, they get kind of upset and worried that they get this kind of like energy dip around 2:00, but that's like actually very normal. So you
It's
can't
not something
really
to fix.
No, it's not something to fix, but you
And
want
do
to
you recommend napping or
Yeah,
what do you
good
recommend?
question. So when you do get that circadian dip, what I would recommend is it depends on kind of where you are and kind of like what your life is like. If you're an entrepreneur and you've got like your own schedule and can take a nap, that's awesome. Take a 20-minute nap to kind of recharge your brain and body. Try not to make it too late in the day, like maybe have a 3:00 cutoff. A lot of people who are, in the corporate setting, and they really can't they can't get out of their cubicle and nap. They will often lean in on a Starbucks run or some kind of coffee hit. And that is actually not the best choice, especially in the afternoon, because not everyone clears caffeine quickly. In fact,
Yeah,
like
that would keep me up all night.
I think that's why a lot of people have sleep problems, quite frankly, is because they're giving their bodies these stimulants at inappropriate times. And what we know is that 60% of people clear caffeine slowly. So that's over half of us. So that's really why I recommend a caffeine curfew around lunchtime, 12-ish, to kind of cut yourself off from caffeine. Because a lot of people, when they get that dip, they reach for the coffee, and that's like really not the best choice. The best choice really in that scenario is, one, a nap if possible, but if that's not possible, then going outside and getting some natural light. The natural light is an actual energy generator. And movement as well is an energy generator. So if you can get out and get a 10-minute walk, a lot of times people will tell me if they're working in an office, well, I'm not supposed to leave my job, my work site or whatever, but like people take smoke breaks.
I was about to say that people would even pretend to be smokers so that they could go out for a smoke break.
I also feel
just to
like
take a walk and take a few breaths.
Yeah.
It's important to note here that like wearing sunglasses as you do this is not recommended. Like I live in a very sunny place, and everybody here wears sunglasses and I don't. I very rarely wear them, maybe like around sunset when it's natural. But you're literally giving yourself artificial light and tricking, your circadian rhythm into thinking it's a different time of day. You also block certain UV light. And so if you're not getting full sunshine, you're not getting the full benefits of the energy generator, right?
Thank you. I am so glad you touched on that because that is like one of my main pet peeves is sunglasses. And I take several walks a day. Obviously, I'm self-employed and I can kind of plan my day to really harness that morning light and then scattered throughout the afternoon. And while I'm walking in my neighborhood, I'm walking my dogs in the morning, I see so many people with sunglasses on and I'm like, you're doing your circadian rhythm a true disservice by doing that. And here's the thing with sunglasses, like they have their use case. And that is really when you're driving and there's a huge glare coming on and you can't see the road. Well, be safe and put on some sunglasses. Or if you're skiing or you're at the beach and there's just a water or snow, huge glare, then that's a better time for sunglasses. But just like in your daily life, I'm astounded with how many people are wearing sunglasses when it's just kind of overcast. And I think it's just out of habit. I think it's just like...
Yeah. And it makes an outfit. I get it.
Yeah. I mean, they're cute. They look cute. They're a fashion statement, but
put them on for the photo.
Yeah. Put them on for the photo and then just tuck them away somewhere.
Yeah.
Good call out on that one. Very good.
Yeah. And I think connected to that, can you define circadian rhythm a little bit? Because I'm not sure everybody necessarily knows what that means and how it connects to melatonin and cortisol and what are the inputs for your circadian rhythm? Like, is it just sunshine or what else is it?
Great question. Well, the circadian rhythm is sort of referring to your 24-hour body clock. And you have something called a suprachiasmatic nucleus, which is your circadian pacemaker. And connected to that circadian pacemaker are all of these different tiny circadian clocks all over your body in every cell and organ. And the idea is to get everything synced up, like imagine like a conductor of an orchestra is the circadian pacemaker. The people in the orchestra need to be synced up to the conductor. So, hence, our cells need to be synced up to that circadian pacemaker to make everything go smoothly. So light is our primary, what we call Zeitgeber, which is a time giver. So when we're thinking about, that's why we're always talking about getting the light in the morning. That strengthens your circadian rhythm and sets you up and tells your body that it's day and do all the things that are appropriate for the day. It sets, you mentioned the cortisol, the melatonin. Basically what you're doing here is you're setting up a healthy cortisol and melatonin pulse. Then the cortisol rises naturally in the morning and then kind of decreases as we wind down our day, and then our melatonin goes up. So sometimes what people will find is that they have a reverse type of situation where the cortisol keeps rising into the night, and that's where we get a lot of issues with insomnia and trouble sleeping. Another Zeitgeber or time giver is meal timing. That's another thing that's really important. And what I recommend for people to do is have their first meal within an hour or two of waking. So maybe an hour, generally speaking, an hour, within an hour of sunrise is a good time to really eat. And of course, that changes throughout the year with the sun rising. That first meal in the morning, I mean, I used to be a big intermittent faster up until about 2 years ago. I wouldn't have my first meal till like 11 a.m. or noon. So I would essentially have 2 meals a day. But what I learned really through a lot of studying about the circadian rhythm and quantum biology is that morning meal is such a powerful trigger to our circadian rhythm that the day has started. So it starts to regulate our digestive hormones and other really important neurotransmitters and hormones. So then having the meals regularly, like having about 4 to 5 hours between each meal, so having that regularity. I mean, of course, everything's going to get thrown off.
Does snacking disrupt your sleep habits?
Oh, it can't. Well, that's a really good question.
Because if you're saying kind of waiting 4 to 5 hours between each meal,
Yeah.
What if you're snacking, grazing the whole day?
Snacking so I'm not a big proponent of snacking during the day because I feel like it's important to give our bodies like 4 to 5 hours to kind of process food. But there are some instances where maybe you didn't get enough protein at a meal and you're going to reach for something. So, but I mean, generally speaking, I mean, I grew up, in an era where like it was like you eat every 3 hours. That was just like what you did. That was sort of like how people were quote trained to enhance their metabolism, which that really doesn't work. But the topic of snacking at night is an interesting one because there's nuance to that. So we're generally recommending that people eat their last bite of food like 2 to 3 hours before bed. So we allow that time for our bodies to digest our food because if we're given the choice between digesting food and sleeping, it's always going to choose the digesting of food. But there's a caveat here, and that is when someone is struggling with a blood sugar regulation issue, sometimes we recommend them have a small snack like an hour before they go to bed. But the snack, you have to be careful about the snack. A lot of people think snack meaning like, cookies or ice cream, like the fun snacks that are like very palatable. But we're talking about maybe a few bites of your leftovers from dinner, or maybe some Greek yogurt with some almonds or something like that. That's
right. Or something with peanut butter, or something that's, some fat and protein so that it's digested slowly, but not too heavy.
Yeah, exactly. Not too heavy. So in those situations, we often find that people will prevent that 3 a.m. wake up because often there's so many reasons for the 3 a.m. wake up, but one of them is that blood sugar dip that happens. And so to mitigate that, you could try having that small snack an hour before bed to see if that helps the wake up. But even if it does, there's still work you need to be doing, kind of more core work in terms of like getting your blood sugar balance from the morning on. So having a continuous glucose monitor can be really helpful to wear overnight to see if the wake ups are correlated with big dips in the blood sugar. Right. So, yeah.
Yeah, I definitely notice, I'll wear my Oura ring from time to time, and I'll definitely notice if I'm eating a large meal before going to bed, especially if it has animal protein in it, or like a fattier animal protein. If it's a burger or like a ribeye steak or something like that. I mean, I am not sleeping well at all that night. My body is working hard at night to digest that.
Yeah. Well, the studies really back that up. People who are taking in a lot of saturated fat at their last meal tend to have lower sleep quality. So when you're thinking about your last meal, you do want to have some protein, but maybe not like a lot of saturated fat, maybe something a little bit lighter, like maybe poultry.
Even some great plant proteins.
Yeah, tempeh, tofu.
And beans.
Yeah,
all
beans.
Are great.
All of those are really good. And having a high fiber dinner as well can be really important for sleep quality.
And helping balance that blood sugar too.
Yes.
And then do you have a special type of sleep wind down routine?
Yes, I do.
What's your nighttime routine?
Get ready to laugh, you all.
Okay, let's hear it.
I'm being totally transparent. I watch TV before bed with my husband every night. And people are like, say that again? Okay, so it's time that we get to spend together. So it's kind of just a shared activity that we can do. And I find myself getting very sleepy by watching TV. Now, the caveat is I'm wearing blue blocking glasses. I'm also watching on a regular TV that's fairly far from where I'm sitting. And the final thing that I always like to stress is the content of what you're watching. I don't watch anything triggering. There's no news. There's no thrillers. Everything that I watch is comedy, documentary, food show, travel show, nothing stimulating.
Don't they say that British Bake Off show is like one of the best shows for sleep?
There you go. You nailed it. That's exactly right. That's what I tell people. If they're like, I need one show, give me one show. That's the show that I would recommend. And that's a show that my husband and I watched regularly especially during the early pandemic. It was just like, we need something to like kind of calm our nervous system down. And that was a great show for it. Absolutely. Now, I think, it works for me. Like it works. I fall asleep very quickly, but it doesn't work for everybody. So
it would put my husband to sleep in a second, and then I'll be there awake, just like watching by myself.
Yeah.
Until the very end.
Yeah. A lot of people get too wrapped up in the content and will keep watching and kind of ignore their cues. But I've gotten to the point where I'm like really tuned into the cues, and I'll be like, yeah, I'm sleepy. I'm yawning. I'm kind of nodding off. Then I get right into bed. But again, it's not something, TV watching is not something that everyone is going to resonate with. It's not going to work for everybody. I think probably if I had to choose one activity for wind down that's probably the best and has like the most data backing it up is reading. I think that's probably the best choice for everyone, because you're not having to use, a lot of light. You can use like a little red light on your book. Again, though, you do need to be careful about the content. I had one client who read and got into a thriller book. She's like, you're never going to believe it. I read until 2 a.m.
Oh, gosh.
And I was like, okay, clearly that wasn't the right choice for you. But yeah, I think everyone is just so individual. And I think everyone needs to kind of find their own thing that gets them in that state of wind down.
But I think what you said is so important, to listen to your cues, because I can definitely be someone who can kind of do a lot of different things. I could watch something with my husband or read a book or even pick up on emails or catch up, and like still get sleepy. But it's like listening to that cue and honoring it. I think it's like so important, because you can just also power through and keep reading or keep but listening and then taking yourself to bed.
Right. Take yourself to bed.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Well, thank
this
you
was so wonderful.
much. Yeah. So much good information.
You're welcome.
We like to end every podcast with some light work for our listeners. So something they can kind of take home and do for themselves based on the learnings from our conversation today.
Yeah. So I think probably the most powerful thing anyone could do for their sleep, and so many people have shared this with me when I either work with them or share this tip on social media. People will respond to me and say, getting the morning sunlight was so incredibly energizing and helped me so much. So if there's just one thing to try it for a week, get outside for like 10 minutes, no sunglasses, and just, experience that natural light and see how you feel for the week. I can almost guarantee you're going to keep doing it if you experience it for a week.
Love that. Love that.
Maybe we'll even throw in a bonus if you can put your bare feet on the ground at the same time.
Even better. Even better.
Yeah. I love it.
Thank you so much, Morgan.
Thank you.